Stories are crucial in history and in education because they, as narratives, they're built on kind of the cold, hard dates and facts, but they make the events real to the young people. And this is true for all of us. We better receive a message. We better receive an idea. If it's in the context of a narrative, it doesn't have to always be that way. But in school, especially when you're talking about virtue and when you're talking about the applications of that which is right and wrong, to give an example. And if the example is within the historical perspective, that is, it actually happened in time and place, it's much more powerful and much more easily understood. And the student can say, well, I'm a human person too. I can also be like that. Stories and the teaching of history. Stories are a part of our lives. Movies, YouTube, stories are all around us. Advertising always tells a story and tells you why you need to buy the product. Stories are everywhere. We live in an age in which, really, we are surrounded by stories. The question for us, and the question for any culture, is what are the stories we're going to pay attention to? What are the stories we're going to focus on? Every culture has stories that it passes on down generation to generation, stories that are passed on to the children, stories that convey some sort of conviction, some sort of principle, some sort of virtue that is held dear and to the heart of a culture and to a people. And so what we're going to look at here today is the question of stories and how they are used in history, in the discussion of history, in the teaching of history, how they are used, and in the situation of a K through 12 school, of a primary, elementary school, middle school, and high school, how they might be used to teach young men and women. I like to begin with a story that will give us a good example, a starting point by which we can understand the teaching of history through stories in school. It was March 15th, 1783. A group of Continental officers of the Continental Army, gathered together at headquarters in Newburgh, New York. It was a dangerous time. The war, for all intents and purposes, had been won. In 1781, they had defeated the British at Yorktown. But it would be another year, 1784, before a peace would finally be established. These officers were disgruntled. They were unhappy. The reason being is that they hadn't been paid what had been promised them. These men had fought for years, many of them. They had suffered. They had gone through all kinds of difficulties, of cold, lack of equipment, lack of food. They had suffered. And now they were here toward the end. The end was in sight, and they were getting anxious. An anonymous pamphlet had gone around among them, frankly encouraging them to be disgruntled. There was a sense of perhaps a suggestion that they might march on Congress in Philadelphia and demand what was due to them, what had been promised to them. This is a dangerous moment. These moments come in revolutions, these dangerous moments in which all that had been fought for, all the principles that had been fought for might be lost. You'd see this later in the 1790s in France. French Revolution dissolved into bloodshed. Much later in the 20th century in Russia, the Bolsheviks, the communists, would rise and turn that revolution into a communist state. It was a dangerous moment. That same day, March 15th, George Washington was present, came into the room. He came into the room and he sat down and he spoke to them. Now, understand, Washington himself had been with many of these men through this whole struggle. He had seen the cold. He had seen the lack of supplies. He'd been with them in victory and defeat, victory at Boston, victory at Trenton, victory at Yorktown. He'd been with them in defeat at Brooklyn. He'd been with them at defeat at Brandywine Creek. He had seen all that they had seen, and he understood their disgruntled attitude. He understood why they were unhappy. And the question here is, what would this man Washington do? How would he react? He came in, he pulled out a pair of glasses, he put them on, and he said, "Gentlemen, you must pardon me. I have grown gray in your service and now find myself growing blind." He read a document, a letter from a member of Congress, and then he read his own speech to these men. And he went right for them. He said, "In the name of our common country, as you value your own sacred honor, as you respect the rights of humanity, do not open the floodgates of civil discord and deluge our rising empire in blood." He went after their sense of honor, their sense of duty, all of the convictions and the principles for which they had fought. Washington reminded them of these things. And as he finished, there were tears in the eyes of many of these officers. All thoughts of sedition, all thoughts of going against the civil government dissolved. And these men reasserted their unshakable confidence, as it goes, to Congress. Washington, he understood his men, that they had suffered. He understood, too, that Congress could be very difficult to work with. But he upheld the right convictions, the right principles, the integrity of civil government, and the integrity of the Republican government that they were about to establish. Major General David Cobb, who served with Washington, said, "I have always considered that the United States are indebted to their Republican form of government solely to the firm and determined republicanism of General Washington at this time." George Washington went on to be president. After the war, he surrendered his military position to the civil government. After 2 terms in the presidency, he surrendered his power back to the people. Over and over again, Washington was an example of solid Republican virtue and conviction. George III, King of England, said to Benjamin West that he placed Washington in a light the most distinguished of any man living at that time. George III called Washington the greatest character of the age. He surrendered power constantly, consistently, something that a person like George III could not understand. Nor, by the way, could Napoleon, who said they, that is the French people, wanted him to be a Washington, which he could not do. Now, this story is important to us because it is true. It is a historical account. We have stories in literature, which many of them are good stories, important stories, but they're stories of imagination, maybe stories of fantasy. What we have here is a story from history, a story drawn from a specific, a real time and place, with a real person, George Washington, our first president. We read literature, important books, stories of imagination and of fantasy, but there are also the stories of history, of people who are living in time and place, real people, people like you and I, people who are imperfect and yet live up to certain convictions and principles, who live up to, in spite of their weaknesses, those high principles that serve as examples to those who are around them and those who follow. This is what Washington did. And we must ask ourselves, this person from history, this person from time and place, what made him who he was? What helped him to establish these convictions, these principles that led America out of moments like the Newburgh Conspiracy? Washington had been offered the opportunity to be dictator during the war. He had been not offered, but it had been suggested that he might be king. And every time this happened, he rejected these possibilities. What kind of man was Washington? How was he shaped? How was he formed? And to a great extent, he was willing to risk all of his wealth, all of his status, even his life, as were all of the founders, anyone who had signed the Declaration of Independence, willing to risk it all for certain principles based upon stories that they had heard, convictions that they had received and made part of their character, received into their hearts and minds and souls. Washington had very little formal schooling like some of his fellow founders, and yet he read the same books. He read the same authors. He was schooled in the same stories of history as they were. And it was from these stories that they drew their sense of that which is right and true and beautiful. Where did these come from? Well, from the Greeks. The study of Greek history, of Herodotus, of Thucydides. The study of Greek philosophy, of Aristotle. Aristotle teaching them about the development of habit, the development of good habit, of civil government. They drew from the Greeks. They drew from the Romans as well. The Greeks invented democracy. The Romans invented republicanism. And it was from these models that these founders drew not only their sense of what was right and their conviction, but also what model, what type of government they might shape. The stories of history helped to inform them and therefore shape their present day. It's also important, in addition to the study of Greece and Rome, drawing upon biblical principles and biblical models. This was constant throughout George Washington's life. His constant reference back to the power of providence in his life, the power of a divine being, of God. Let's look for a moment at a couple of the characters, a couple of the historical figures from the past that Washington drew upon. He was, by the way, at his heart, at his core, a farmer. He loved Mount Vernon. And as a general, as a president, he was constantly concerned with Mount Vernon. How is the farm? How are the crops? How are the buildings? Are they being taken care of? Very much a part of his republicanism, his hands in the earth. His ancient model for this was a man named Cincinnatus. Cincinnatus was himself a farmer and a senator in ancient Republican Rome. Cincinnatus was called forward to help Rome escape from danger, from a particularly egregious moment, egregious threat from outside. Cincinnatus stepped forward. He saved Rome from its threat, came back, surrendered his power, and returned to the farm. Washington surrendered his power and returned to the farm. Cincinnatus, there's a city in Ohio named after this great Roman Republican figure. Washington and his fellow founders also very much appreciated a man named Cato, Cato the Younger, who rather than give in to the tyranny of Julius Caesar, preferred to die. Cato was well known among all of the founders. Another, Cicero, the great orator who also defended Republican Rome against the tyranny of Caesar, against the tyranny of Augustus, and died for it. These were models for Washington, and very much a part of his character and how he stood up for the Republican convictions of early America. Carl Richard, modern historian, wrote a book, Greeks and Romans Bearing Gifts. The book is about those gifts, those stories passed on from the ancients to our founders. He writes that he's struck by the ancient historians' remarkable gift as storytellers, by the profound impact of their stories on the founding fathers, and by most modern Americans' lack of familiarity with many of these influential stories. Too many of these stories have been forgotten. Too many of these stories have been left behind. It is for us now, in the K through 12 sphere, to recapture these stories, the ancient Greek, the ancient Roman, the ancient biblical stories, which informed our founders and should inform our education and our principles, our convictions. How do we do this? How do we go about it? Well, there are many resources available to schools, available to parents, available to teachers that can be used to reintroduce the great stories, the great virtuous stories of the past, to reintroduce them into the modern world. For instance, Ingrid D'Aulaire has created two very nice biographies, one of George Washington, one of Abraham Lincoln. These are designed for the youngest of the children in schools, kindergarten, first and second grade, perhaps third grade. In these grades, biography of the great exemplars, the great examples, the great individuals of the past can be used for children to wrap their minds around the idea of who these people were, that they were living real figures, and they pass on to us ideas, virtues that we might also copy. In middle school, it's a very good time in middle school, 5th, 6th, 7th, and 8th grades, to begin to construct for the students an understanding of the chronology, the dates, which so many students hate to memorize, but they're so important because they are the building blocks for understanding the chronology, the series of events in which these stories take place. John Heron wrote two very nice volumes for 5th, 6th, 7th, and 8th graders, one entitled The Famous Men of Greece, another entitled Stories of Roman Heroes. And from their titles, you understand that these are books that can be used well to pass on these stories of history, these great men, great women who were exemplars of the kinds of virtues and the kinds of principles that we should inherit and pass on to our children. In high school, this is the time when students can begin to read deeply in these stories, read deeply in these histories. Among the Greeks, to study the father of history, Herodotus, or Thucydides to understand in the Peloponnesian Wars what happened to the Greeks in a great civil war which almost destroyed Athenian democracy. To read in the Roman authors, Julius Caesar and his Gallic Wars, his conquest of Gaul. This is something that used to be read by all students up until 50 or 60 years ago. This is a series of stories of great efforts that can be used to teach the students about Rome. The historian Livy, Cicero, reading portions of Cicero, particularly perhaps from his Laws. Plutarch of the first century in Rome, brought together biographies of famous Greeks and Romans. These are biographies, these are stories about famous Greeks and Romans that were passed down generation to generation. Stories read by our founders and understood. Victories as well as defeats, virtues as well as evil done by these men in these biographies that serve as great lessons down through history. All of this is good. It is good for the teaching of young people as we prepare them for adulthood. Now, who's going to be doing this teaching? First and foremost, and this is something we must recapture, first and foremost, it must be the parents. Parents must have an understanding, a conviction that all of these ancient stories are important for their young people, their children to learn. Parents must set aside all of the electronic gadgets that get in the way and help these young people to pick up the book and to read and to get after these great examples of virtue, of faith, of conviction. Teachers must be well versed. Too often in the current day, teachers are taught to give tests, to fill in, to have their children fill in bubbles, to meet legislated marks of curriculum rather than to really dig into the meat of the literature, the meat of history, the meat of these stories. There are a number of very fine resources that are available for teachers to help them understand how and what they should do. Susan Wise Bauer has written a very fine book, The Well-Trained Mind, a book that should be used and read by teachers. She also has produced 3 very fine volumes, A History of the Ancient World, History of the Medieval World, History of the Renaissance World, very useful for teachers in classrooms who want to recapture these stories and want to recapture the convictions that we're talking about. E.D. Hirsch, in his core knowledge curriculum, in his book, Cultural Literacy, also helps the teacher to grab hold of what is needed and what is necessary. He's written a series of books, 1st through 6th grade. For instance, what your third grader needs to know. Wonderful title. And it lays out many of these stories as well as the art, the music of the ancient past that students need to know. History can also be used, and the stories of history can also be used as something of an organizing structure for school. This is something that has been lost as well, not only in the teaching of virtue, not only in the teaching of right and wrong, but also in the teaching of literature. How is literature best understood, and what an author is trying to do best understood, unless it is connected to its historical context? So as you're reading the stories of history and understanding the historical context, you can also draw in the imaginary stories, the literature, and read them side by side. To study Greek history and bring in Homer's Iliad and Odyssey. to read Roman history, to bring in the Aeneid, to read medieval history, and to bring in Dante. It makes sense, chronological study of the historical stories as well as the literature. It's a way to structure the study of literature. Also in the study of writing, as students learn to write, they can copy the great works that have been given to them. And they can learn what kind of grammar, what kinds of sentence structure the great authors of history have used. It is a way of teaching writing, teaching them grammar, teaching them syntax and the structure of sentences. You can, of course, teach mythology, Greek and Roman mythology, bringing in also the theology, reading in the Old and New Testament, the Hebrew and Christian scriptures. And all of the virtues, all of the principles found therein can be brought into the student's life. Mythology, theology, philosophy, the study of the great philosophers, Aristotle and Plato, as I have said, going forward to Thomas Aquinas, to all of the great philosophers of the day of the periods, from ancient to medieval to Renaissance. Students in the K through 12 range, especially in the upper grades, can be taught, should be taught philosophy. And through the stories of history, this can be introduced into their lives. And then bringing us back around to Washington and the founders, an understanding of civics, of government, political study. By studying the ancients and by studying their thoughts, we can understand why an Adams, why a Madison, a Jefferson, why these men made the choices they did in creating this mixed constitution that we have, this brilliant constitution that serves as a foundation of our American political culture. It is so essential. To understand these ancients helps us to understand the decisions made in the 1700s, and therefore who we are and what we ought to uphold in our republic, in our constitutional government. Now, education isn't just about creating citizens. Understand that education, in its best sense, is about making us more human. And the study of history, the stories of history, help us to understand how humans in the past were shaped and formed, and how they became more human in understanding virtue, in understanding principles and convictions of that which is right and true and beautiful. We want to raise these young people thinking of these K through 12 students as future adults. What are they going to look like as adults? What do we want them to be as adults? Intelligent, virtuous people. That's what we want. And secondary to that is the idea that they're also going to be great employees and great employers. They will be great workers. But that's not the end to make them drone workers. But someone so educated, well educated, will do well. And as citizens, it's not that we want them to become just citizens of a state, but as citizens reading in the stories of history, being intelligent and virtuous adults, they are also great citizens, governing themselves and therefore governing the government, not being subject to the government, but being the government themselves. This is what we intend through reading the stories of history. This is how Washington was shaped, and the founders were shaped. History is a narrative of all that has come before, not just there to be left hanging, but to be studied and understood. to be used for our benefit. We live in a modern world in which there is the arrogance of the modern, as if anything that came before us was not useful. What we are doing in telling the stories of history is recapturing all of that wisdom that went before us. C.S. Lewis says this: the only palliative to this modern perspective is to keep the clean sea breeze of the centuries blowing through our minds. And this can be done only by reading old books. Often when we think of old books, we think of them as dusty and as covered with the earth as if it's an archaeological site. What Lewis is saying here, and what truth we're pulling out of this question, is that the ancients serve as a reminder of all the truths and wisdom that they pass on down to us. And they blow as this wonderful sea breeze, encouraging us to read the old books. You know, this isn't just for a class of people. This isn't just for the elite. This is for all citizens. Plumbers should be reading Plato. This is for all citizens. Abigail Adams was schooled in this way. These convictions were at the foundation of Frederick Douglass's insistence that he was a human person. These ideals, these convictions passed down to us have been a part and must continue to be a part of who we are. A final story. Winston Churchill, Prime Minister of England, stood alone with his country. Sometimes, I'm sure it felt like him alone, against this rising tide, this darkness, this shadow of National Socialism, the Nazis. In 1937, he wrote, "How astonishing it is that present-day civilization should be exposed to dangers from which it was believed the labors of the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries had permanently rid the world. Many communities," he says, "have been plunged back into a state of insecurity hitherto only associated with barbarism." Europe was being thrown back into a barbaric era. And Churchill was determined to stand up and oppose it. It's interesting when talking about his life as a schoolboy. He did not have the greatest experience. He wasn't the best of students. In fact, I remind teachers often of this, that Winston Churchill himself was not the best student, and one of those students in our classes who's not the best student may someday be a Churchill. He learned, though, through the ages, through his years. He returned to Harrow, his school, in 1941, and he gave a speech to the boys there. He said, "Never give in, never give in, never, 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 never. In nothing great or small, large or petty, never give in except to convictions of honor and good sense." Where did Winston Churchill learn this? What informed his heart, his soul, his mind, his convictions? Well, though he had a difficult time as a student, there is one bright shining moment there that he talked about in which he won an award for memorizing 1,200 lines of Lord Babington Macaulay's great poetic work, The Lays of Ancient Rome. In that is this quote. In that piece is this quote touching on the life of Publius Horatius Cocles, who stood alone to defend Rome at the Sublician Bridge, alone while his comrades tore down the bridge behind him so that he could save the city. From the Lays of Ancient Rome by Macaulay is this: "Then outspoke brave Horatius, the captain of the gate. To every man upon this earth death cometh soon or late. And how can man die better than facing fearful odds for the ashes of his fathers and the temples of his gods?" These are the kinds of ideas that informed Churchill. And he led the West against Nazi Germany, the National Socialists. And he himself inspired Ronald Reagan, Margaret Thatcher. Reagan says, once before, his had been a voice crying out in the wilderness against the suicidal dogmas of appeasement. Reagan goes on to talk about Churchill. Once before, he had sounded an alarm against those deluded souls who thought they could go on feeding the crocodile with bits and pieces of other countries and somehow avoid the jaws themselves. Reagan refers back to Churchill in Reagan's own sense of determination to hold out against communist Russia. Mrs. Thatcher also often talked about Churchill as her model, as she stood up against the same. Leonid Brezhnev, the General Secretary of the Soviet Union, said that Margaret Thatcher was trying to wear the trousers of Winston Churchill. The ancients informed Washington. Washington informs us. The ancients informed Churchill, who also informed and encouraged Reagan and Thatcher and that generation. You see, from the past we receive these great stories of history. And for us, it is to receive them and to model them and create our stories today, that we may then, with all of these stories of history, pass them on to our children and to our children's children, so that these young people learning the stories of history might have the conviction and the principles of their forebears. Thank you.